Welcome to LabMinutes.com. In this video, we will be installing Cisco Nexus 1000V on VMware with Layer 3 mode. We will use the .ova file to install VSM for both primary and secondary, and we will install VEM manually as well as using the VMware Update Manager. We assume that you have basic understanding of the Nexus 1000V, so if not, I recommend you watch our video RS0020 Introduction to Nexus 1000V before proceeding with this lab. Here's our lab setup. So in the physical topology, we have two ESXi server, ESXi 1 and 2. Each has 4 NICs, 0 through 3, and we also have an iSCSI storage. On the logical topology, if you guys recall back in the Layer 2 mode video, we have a 3 critical VLAN, which is control, management, and packet. Now that we are going to be doing Layer 3 mode, things looks a little different. So on the control VLAN, it is now exclusively used by the primary and secondary VSM to maintain their edge asynchronization. So you can see that right now VEM doesn't really need to be on that VLAN. And we still use VLAN number 111 for that. Now for the second VLAN, management VLAN 112, it remains pretty much the same, which is for the VSM to communicate to the vCenter. And now we're going to be using that same interface or VLAN to communicate to the VEM as well across the Layer 3 by routing. And now the third VLAN, what used to be in the Layer 2 mode, a packet VLAN, VLAN 113, we're going to repurpose that VLAN and use it for our VEM Control interface. And this is just the Layer 3 VMkernel interface that VEM will be using to communicate with the VSM. The remaining part of the lab remains pretty much the same as our previous video. So we have a vMotion VLAN at the VLAN 59, an iSCSI VLAN at the ID 60. And we have a main server VLAN 32 where our ESXi management interface is sitting on at .4 and .6 IPs. We have a vCenter appliance at .5, a jump box, a Windows 2008 machine at .40, and our test machine, which is also running our update manager at .42. So we're going to start our lab with everything being on a traditional vSwitch 1, and then once we get the Nexus 1000V built, we're going to be migrating all the VMs from the vSwitch to the Nexus 1000V. And the Nexus 1000V will be using two network interfaces on each of the ESXi and connected to the uplink switch using LACP. There are some prerequisites to installations. At this point, you should have all of your ESXi server added to the vCenter. And if you plan to use the VMware Update Manager to install your VEM, you should have that installed on one of your server as well. And you should have downloaded the Nexus 1000V software package from Cisco.com. And finally, you need to have all the information that you will be needing as part of installation. And this is, for example, the IP address, username, password, the vCenter, the username, password, the VLAN IDs that you plan to use to install the Nexus 1000V. Since we have all this information ready, we can proceed with our lab. The first thing we're going to do is to create the primary VSM. As you can see in the diagram, or like we mentioned, we're going to be using two VLANs here, one for control and one for management. So to start creating that on our vSwitch, so first we'll go to the ESXi one under networking and the vSwitch, go to property, and we can add. We're going to call it VSM Control. Just going to copy and paste here to make sure there's no typo. And they will be tagged as VLAN 111. Finish. We'll create a second VLAN 112. Click Next. Click Finish. And we have to also create the same set of VLAN on ESXi 2 where the secondary VSM is going to be installed. So add in VLAN 111. And then we also add VLAN 112. So now that we have those VLAN created, we can start installing our VMs using the OVA. So here we'll go to File, Deploy OVF Template. And this is the OVA file that you have extracted from the Nexus 1000V software package that you downloaded. So we point to that file basically. We'll click Next. There's just some hardware specs of the VM. We'll click Next. We'll accept the agreement. We'll click Next. Now we have to give it a name. So it'll be LM N1KV -PRI for primary. We'll click Next. With the 3 installer options for our primary, we're going to go with the manually configure Nexus 1000V. And once that's chosen, you can see a little note here where it said, if this option is selected, please ignore the properties section ahead, which we'll see in the second. So we'll click Next. Now we have to select the ESXi host that we want the primary VSM to be on. We want to select ESXi number 1. We're going to choose to install that on the iSCSI with the thick provision. And we're going to map the control interface to the control VLAN that we have created, and the management interface to the management VLAN. As far as the packet interface, there's nothing we really have to, or VLAN we have to map it to at this point, because layer 3 mode doesn't use the packet VLAN, so we can leave it at default. Okay, so this is the property section that the previous page was talking about. This is only for when you were doing the top 2 installer options. If you do it manually, we're going to go through entering this through the setup process on the CLI, so we can totally ignore this page if you choose to do it manually. Okay, make sure everything looks correct and choose to power on VM once it's been deployed. So now we just have to wait for the VM to be created. So now the VM is successfully created. We can open up the console and wait for it to prompt you for further input. Okay, so the first thing we're being prompted here is the password for the admin account. So here we type in the password, make sure it meets the password complexity. And you have confirmed the password. And then we have to select the role that this particular VSM will be using. So for us it's primary. And domain ID, we're going to keep it simple as 1. Make sure that's unique in your environment. And now it's asking you if you want to step through the basic configuration dialog. In the previous video with the layer 2 mode, we did not do this since we chose to do it manually. But here, let's go through this setup process. So let's choose yes. We do not want to create an additional blocking account, so say no. We do not want to set SNMP at this time, so no, no. Switch name, call it LM-N1KV. And we do want to configure our out-of-band management interface, and the IP for that is 172.16.112.16. The /24 subnet mask, and the gateway is 112.1. We can skip the advanced IP option, disable telnet, enable SSH. We want to use RSA key with default 1024 key length is okay. Make sure to enable HTTP server, and we do not want to do NTP server at this time. And we'll leave the VEM feature level at default. And let's go ahead and set the SVS domain parameter as well. So here by default, layer 3 mode is selected, so choose that. And make sure the configuration looks good, and then we can proceed. Okay, so we do not want to edit, and we want to save the config. Okay, now we can log in using our credential we just created. First thing we want to check is the interface IP. So show IP interface briefed, and by default the management interface is on its own VRF called management, so make sure you put that in. And the interface status is up, up, and up. Then we can try to ping the default gateway of 112.1. Again, make sure you specify which VRF. And we can successfully ping our default gateway. Now what I want to show you, let's go ahead and do show run and look at some config here. Under the SVS domain, you can see the control VLAN and packet VLAN has the ID of 1. But since we're not using either of those VLANs here in layer 3, in fact, if you're trying to change it, so if you go under SVS domain, and let's say we want to change the control VLAN to maybe 2, you can see the little warning message that said, although the control packet VLAN can be configured, it's not really applicable to the layer 3 mode, so pretty much irrelevant. Let's change that back to control VLAN 1. And one more thing I want to point it out to you is by default in layer 3 mode, the VSM will use this management interface to communicate with the VEM. Although you have an option to create a dedicated interface if you want to keep the traffic between the VEM and the VSM separated from the other management traffic, you can create or configure a control interface Let me show you that first. So show run interface control 0. You can see it's not really used right now without any IPs, and once you specify the IP, you can configure it right here with mode layer 3 interface, and you can switch from management 0 to control 0 instead. Again, if your intention is to keep it separated. Although personally I don't see a lot of benefit of doing that, and you're pretty much going to need additional IP for it. So in this lab we're just going to keep using the management 0 for that. Okay, now that the primary VSM is up, we can go ahead and create our secondary VSM. So follow the same process with on the vCenter with the deploy OVF and the OVA file, except here we'll give it a name lm-n1kv-sec for secondary. And now instead of doing manually, let's go and this time try the secondary installer, so Nexus 1000V secondary. And again, taking a little note here, it said you can ignore section C through E in the upcoming page. Okay, so we want to install that in our ESXi2, iSCSI storage with a thick provision, and we'll map the control interface to control VLAN, management interface to the management VLAN. We'll just ignore the packet VLAN, and right here we'll give it domain ID 1 that matches what you configure on the primary, as well as the same password. And here we can totally ignore the management IPs and all that, since all of those has already been configured on the primary. So click next, or click finish. So while we're waiting for that to be created, we can try to SSH to our VSM that's running right now. And I already have the entry created on the PuTTY. Just to show you, the IP is the management IP 112.16. So we SSH to that, we accept the key, and then we'll log in just like we did on the console. And now we are on the command line. So we can close down the console page. Let's go back to the vCenter. So now that is created. Let's bring up the console for the secondary. Okay, so you can see some activity on the console here. So what's happening is the installer basically took the parameters that we entered, and that was the domain ID and the password, and kind of run the script on your behalf as if you were doing this manually. And then if you've tried this to install the secondary VSM manually, you would know it has to go through a reboot, which is what's going to happen right here. Okay, so now while the secondary is being rebooted, let's do on the SSH session, let's do turn on, and then we're just going to monitor activity on the primary VSM here. Okay, so we start getting some logging messages here. It said module 2 is now detected, and on the background with the console, we're getting the switch login prompt. Okay, so it said module 2 is detected, and the configuration copy has already started. So let's give it a couple seconds here. And now you see that the module is now becoming online. So that means if we do show module, you can see that the second VSM shows up with the HA standby state. Okay, so now that we have a functioning redundant pair of VSM, we can go ahead and connect the VSM to the vCenter. And in order to do that, we first have to register the VSM XML extension file to as the vCenter plugin. First, we need to download the file, and that means we need to bring up a browser and browse to the VSM IP. Right here, we got Cisco Nexus 1000V extension file with the .xml, so we can save that. So save link as, we're going to put it on desktop, which is going to overwrite the one that we used for the previous lab. Once it's downloaded, you can go back to the vCenter and the plugins, and then managed plugins. Go right click new plugins, and you can browse to that .xml file and click register plugin. We can ignore certificate, and now it says successfully registered, and it shows up on the list right here. So we'll close. Now if we go back to the VSM, we can try to establish a connection to the vCenter. And the way to do that, you do command svs connection, and then we'll give it the name of the connection as an identifier. Call it lmsvs, underscore SVS. And the protocol will be VMware VIM. We'll specify the remote IP address of the vCenter, which is 172.16.32.5. And we also need to specify the data center name that we want our DVS to be installed under. So for us, it's LM-DC1, enter, and then we can go ahead and connect. Now you can see in the background there's some activity as far as the distributed virtual switch being created, and we also getting similar logging messages here on the console with the port groups. Some of the port groups has been created on the vCenter. So we go to networkings. Now we have the LM1KV name shows up with the default port groups. Okay, now just like any other switch, before you can start placing hosts on it, you have to create VLANs that you plan to put the host on. So here we start off with our VLAN 32, and we'll give it a name of server. Now we have VLAN 59 with the name for vMotion, VLAN 60 for iSCSI, VLAN 111 for Nexus 1000V, VSM Control. Actually, let me remove that. And we want to do 112. And this one is VSM Management. And the last one, which is 113, is VEM Control. Okay. And we need to enable feature LACP, since we'll be configuring LACP port channel uplinks. The next thing, we need to create a port profile, which is nothing but a switch port configuration template that we will be assigning to our virtual machine when we migrated the virtual machine over to the Nexus 1000V. And if you do port profile and type, there's two types. Ethernet is for physical uplink to the upstream network device, and the vEthernet is the interface that's facing the VM. Here we're dealing with uplink, so it will be type Ethernet, and we'll call it uplink VEM. First, we'll define it as the VMware port groups. And if you do question mark, you can also specify a different name, which is the name that the vCenter will see. But if you do not specify that, it's just going to use the same name as the port profile itself. And since the uplink is going to be a trunk, we'll make it mode trunk, and then we'll only going to allow certain VLANs. And we are dealing with 32, 59 through 60, and 111 through 113. Okay, now we create a channel group, and the only options you have here is auto. So that means the VSM will automatically pick the port channel group number for you. And when you do mode, you have three options: active, on, and passive. So on is when you're dealing with an upstream network device that doesn't do the LACP, or if you were to do a port channel to a device that not capable of, for example, the multi-chassis Ether channel. So that means it's two separate network devices. And a good example is the UCS Fabric Interconnect. Then you would do mode on, and then you have an option of MAC pinning or subgroups. Okay, but for us, we're going to be connected to a network switch that's capable of LACP, and it's a single switch. That means we're going to do mode active. Then we know shut. And one of the most important thing here is to define a system VLAN, which is the VLAN you would want VEM to forward the traffic on, regardless of its state or connectivity state to the VSM. So this is pretty much like an always forwarding VLANs. And you usually put service critical VLAN as a system VLAN, and 32, for example, is our vCenter, 60 is the iSCSI, especially if you do like a network boot, and then obviously all the VLAN that's related to the Nexus 1000V itself. So, and then state enable. Okay, you can see the uplink VEM port group kind of popped up here in the background on the vCenter as soon as you issue the state enable command. Okay, so the next port profile we are going to create, this is going to be for, like we mentioned at the beginning of the video, the VEM is going to be using a dedicated VMkernel interface to communicate with the VSM. So this requires a spatial type of port profile. And since it's the VM facing port profile, it's going to be a type V Ethernet, and we're going to call it VMK Control, VMK for VMkernel. And the key command here is the capability command. And for the control interface, we need to specify it as the L3 control. Okay, the rest of it is pretty much the same. And this is just another warning message just to remind you that make sure it specifies the system VLAN also. Okay, the rest of it looks very similar with switch port mode access. And we know, or we mentioned that's going to be on the VLAN 113 for the control. We do node shut, and then you do system VLAN 113, and then we'll push it up to the vCenter. Okay, so now we have to finish up with the remaining VLANs that we have. Just to kind of speed up our configuration, I'm going to go ahead and copy this port profile right here and then work it on Notepad. Okay, first one is for VLAN 32, so we can say VM VLAN 32 mode access VLAN 32, and we want that to be a system VLAN because it's where our vCenter and the ESXi management interface or IPs are on. And I believe we need 4 VLAN altogether. The next one is 59, which is our vMotion. vMotion doesn't really have to be a system VLAN, so we can delete that. And 60 is an iSCSI, and that we want for the system VLAN since it's going to provide storage to our ESXi. And again, you don't really need to put out the VLAN as a system VLAN, and also there's a limit as far as number of system VLAN you can define. Just keep that in mind. And then you have VLAN 111, 111, and our last one is 112. Okay, I think that's it. So copy, then we'll paste. And on the background, we should see all those port groups created. Okay, 111, 112, 32, 59, and 60. All right, now we have to create that VM kernel interface the VM is going to use for the control traffic. And to do that, we'll go back to the host and cluster, and we have to create one for each. And we're just going to put on the vSwitch one for now, since we're not going to be using it at this point. But when we migrate it over to 1000V, you will see that we will need to use those. So switch one, we'll go property, add it, and we'll add it as VMkernel. Let's put a name to that. So VMkernel VEM. VLAN ID is not really important at this point because later on you're going to see that we're going to assign a port groups to this from the port profile we created on the VSM with a spatial L3 control capability. So we can leave that at that default for now, but we need to give it an IP, and we say it's going to be on 113, and we want to keep the last octet lines up with the number that our IP we're using for the ESXi management, which is .4 and 255.255.0, and make sure we put the gateway in there as well, since this has to be routable when it tries to talk to the VSM management IP that's sitting on different VLAN 112. Okay, so go next, finish. Okay, we can close that out right now, and then we have to create one for the ESXi2 as well. So add VMkernel, next, -VEM, leave the ignore the VLAN number, and then give it an IP 113.6 on this one, and again the gateway. Next, finish. Okay, now we can close that. So that should be all the configuration that we need at this point for the VSM. Next, we can start installing the VEM.